Hey everybody, how are you? Time for another video lecture, this time on the topic of Chapter 3, Relativism. I'm here in my beautiful office and I've never figured out how to flip the camera around so you'll see that all of the writing is backwards, but half of it's in Russian anyway, so probably couldn't tell if it was forward or backwards. Wouldn't make a difference to me either. So I think this will be a relatively short video. We'll see, won't we? I wanted to begin by pointing your attention to page 132 because you might have read the chapter and become puzzled by the fact that the author discusses a topic in a certain perspective and then rips it to shreds. And you might have wondered in the middle of that ripping to shreds, why would you bother mentioning and discussing something if we're going to reject it? A couple things to say about that. One, just because the author rejects something doesn't mean you have to reject it. The author should give good reasons for rejecting it, and you should try to evaluate those reasons as best as you can. Secondly, the author tries to defend and explain her method on page 132 in the box 3-3, talking about, I would describe this basically as the idea of testing ideas. How do you test an athlete? Well, if it's a sprinter, you set up the blocks and you sprint. If it's a matter of endurance, you test them by pushing them farther and farther. So we're all familiar with the idea of testing something to see if it holds up. We've all seen examples of athletes who don't hold up. But how do you test ideas? You test ideas by questioning them, by criticizing them in any way you can. You don't know how an idea is going to hold up until you have questioned it. So relativism is a topic that emerges all the time in ethics. And I think the chapter does a nice job of giving a bit of the historical reasons for why it has emerged so forcefully in Western societies. One of those main reasons being a kind of collective guilt and a collective understanding after 350 years of slavery, for example. After hundreds of years of telling women they have no rights except if they're married. Several hundred years of colonialism and imperialism in which European peoples claiming to be inspired by God or to be superior to other people in different ways went around the world and claimed other lands, other properties, other goods, very often human beings, as their own property. We look back on most of those things now and criticize them and are somewhat embarrassed by them or scandalized by them. Certainly slavery, right? There's no one in your life, I would guess, who looks back on slavery with any kind of ambivalence and says, well, there were some good things about it. No, it's universally condemned as a horrible institution, a horrible practice. But 150 years ago, it wasn't. In Western culture, in the United States. So we'll have to confront the question of how values change over time and what that means. But relativism has become, as the chapter explains, a very popular and common perspective, and very often people feel that it's the right view because what they're trying to do is avoid the sins of the past, so to speak. So if you're a relativist, the last thing you're going to advocate is that we go to another country and tell them what to do and take them over and impose our own systems and values on them. A relativist is horrified by the very idea. So relativism provides a safe haven against that kind of guilt. Right? At least I'm not going to be a colonialist. At least I'm not going to be, imposing my values on other people, and that's good. What the chapter tries to do, though, is analyze, it's using analysis, to break down some of the assumptions and some of the implications of that relativist position. And according to the author, when you break them down, they begin to fall apart. They can't really hold together very well. The purpose of my lecture today is not to argue for or against relativism at all. In fact, I'm not going to make a lot of arguments at all myself. What I want to do is take you through a couple of scenarios and talk about how the four positions that the author lays out, nihilism, relativism, soft universalism, and hard universalism, would look at those situations. Have you follow the train of thought and the logic in those explanations. We'll look at another scenario and do the same thing, and then I'll lead you through a few questions and observations about what we're doing, what we've learned, and then I'll suggest that there are a few other traditional responses to relativism, and these are responses we'll be dealing with in the rest of the semester, so it's a good time to introduce them. And then we'll be done. Let me say, I'll give you this assignment at the end as well. For next week, as you're doing the readings and watching this, your homework, although it's really in-class work, you need to come prepared to answer the question of how you would deal with these scenarios that I'm laying out. What would you do? And why? And as we talk about those responses in class, we'll sort of look and see, well, are you closer to being a nihilist here, or a soft universalist, or a hard universalist? And we'll see that, hopefully, how your opinions and your instincts, your views on these situations can be illuminated and understood in terms of the language of the chapter. Okay. The book offers several different responses to the question of cultural differences and lays out, the anthropologists who visited these other cultures and discovered some practices that seemed perfectly reasonable to those people and seemed completely irrational and immoral to us. I'm guessing that none of us has ever gone to a funeral and eaten the dead person we were honoring. But in some cultures that's perfectly normal. In fact, it's part of your duty. Lots of cultures have what we would consider very bizarre and wrong practices. When my daughter gets sick, I don't go to my neighbors and kill one of their children. But in some cultures that's expected. So even the family of that child I might kill, my neighbor's family, would say, well, yeah, he did the right thing. He was supposed to do that. Completely bizarre, right? But it really pushes the question of, on what basis, on what grounds can we, inside our culture, make those judgments about people from a different culture? If it seems acceptable and good to them, who are we, people say, right, to say different? So let's take a specific case and work through this. Imagine that you're traveling to another country for business and you stay at a hotel. That night you go out to eat and by the way, all my examples are probably going to involve eating, so just get used to it. That night you go out to eat and you walk by a group of men in a ring, a circle, cheering on two young boys, say 7 or 8 years old, who are in a fight. This goes on for quite a while. You stop to see what's going on and you're horrified. You begin to see that the boys are boxing. They're getting beat up pretty bad. Periodically they'll cry and plead. They're bleeding, bruised. in pretty bad shape, but they continue to fight. Sometimes they beg to stop, but the men tell them to continue until one of them is clearly unable to fight, completely defeated. The men cheer them on, and after a while you realize that the men have placed bets on the fight. So you ask one of the men, "What's going on?" And he says, "Oh, this is a common and very ancient custom in our country. Been going on for generations." You say, "Well, okay, it might be an old custom, but why do you still do it? You don't have to do it." And he gives you 3 reasons. He says, "It's fun. It's entertaining. We like it. Like any sport, it involves some violence and pain, but that's part of the sport." Secondly, he says, we're a poor country, and this is part of our economy. This is the way money is exchanged. People make money. It's like any place that has gambling or lotto. It's good for the economy. And third, it's good for the boys. It builds their character. They become tough, and we need tough boys. So you stand there puzzled for a while, taking all of this in, and you look again at the boys, and you see one of them has recognized you as a stranger, a foreigner, and he reaches out to you for help, and he pleads with you, "Rescue me. Save me." What should you do? Take that in. Got the situation? Let's go through the 4 perspectives that the author describes in the book. 4 general ways in which people think about ethics and values. The first she describes, of course, is nihilism. Nihil or nihil comes from, I believe it's the Latin word for nothing. So nihilism is the philosophy that says nothing matters. Nothing is nothing. Everything is nothing. Nothing is anything. Everything is nothing. Including ethics, including values. So nihilism usually presents itself when people have experienced repeated traumatic violence. Lots of soldiers, perhaps, can become nihilistic. But not just that. We can, of course, read the news and become nihilistic. Or perhaps they just encounter different cultures, the way that Ruth Benedict did and other people, and they haven't given up on life. They're not nihilistic about everything, but the possibility of establishing values across cultures, the idea that any 2 cultures or 4 cultures or all the cultures of the world could get together and agree on basic values, they say, there's nothing to that. It's impossible. It's a stupid idea. Give it up. We're never going to have ethics that can reach across cultures. And in fact, a nihilist will go farther than that and say, probably won't have values that reach across people. And temporarily, people might agree not to beat each other up, but ultimately, there's no reason why people should be good or bad, because good or bad are just words that amount to nothing. You could perhaps, if you were the person in this scenario, if you're horrified enough by this violence, and you begin to extrapolate, meaning you begin to think, wow, this guy just told me this has been going on for hundreds of years, probably not just in this village, but across the country, and I bet if I traveled around the world to other countries, I would find other equally horrifying things, and you begin to think, maybe my faith in humanity is misplaced, and maybe humanity really doesn't deserve the respect that I've given it, and maybe all this talk about ethics is really just an illusion. So that's nihilism. Relativism, cultural relativism, is close to that, but it takes a slightly different perspective. As you know, if you read the chapter, cultural relativism says that there are meaningful, real values, and there are real ethical values. So there really is right and wrong, really is good and bad. The nihilist is too radical in their dismissal of ethics completely. But what the relativist will say, the nihilist is right that people across cultures cannot speak to one another, cannot really understand one another, especially when it comes to ethics. So relativism says, of course we have ethics, but the we means the people in my group. I'm raised in a culture. That culture has a whole bunch of customs and ways of living that I adopt, and they seem natural to me. So, I may eat my uncle for dinner in some cultures, and that's perfectly natural. I may kill my neighbor because my daughter got sick. Lots of things like this. They're just natural to the people within that culture. And there is no reason to assume, according to the relativist, there's absolutely no reason to assume that someone growing up in a different culture will share the values that I share in my culture. In fact, lots of these anthropological examples seem to demonstrate that people don't share values across cultures. So the relativist will emphasize the differences among cultures and say, this is empirical proof. This is it right here. You can see it. You would not even dream of putting two boys in a ring, beating the shit out of each other, and getting entertainment out of it and making money off of it. And yet it's perfectly natural. In fact, these guys think it's good. It's helping the boys and helping the economy. So the relativist will take the empirical, the kind of facts we've talked about of differences among cultures and take them to be the final word. The final word, meaning if you ever try from within your culture to reach outside of your culture and to tell other people how they should live, you are making a fundamental error because you don't have the perspective they have. You were raised in their culture. So if you analyze the situation we're looking at from this perspective, of course the nihilist is going to say, you might have some feelings about this, it might gross you out, but that's the end of it. There's really nothing to be done. And the nihilist will probably say, hey look, if you want to reach in and pull the boy out, you can do that. If you want to leave him there, you can do that. It's the same. Neither one's good, neither one's bad. These are just words. The relativist will say that you have physically entered another culture, so you're there, so to speak, but what it means to live in a culture is not simply to cross a boundary in space. What it means to be in another culture is to have been born into it and to learn how to think from within the perspective and the values of that culture. So when you are considering reaching into that ring and pulling out the boy, you are doing that in the other country, but not in the other culture. You're still in your culture. Because everything you've learned about right and wrong come from your culture. You bring that with you. It's kind of in your head. It's locked in your head. And you just experience the world. No matter where you are physically, you still experience the world from that cultural perspective. So when you're reaching in to grab the boy, you are doing something right from within your cultural perspective, but you may be doing something wrong within that culture. And if you want to choose to violate the ethics of another culture, you are overstepping your boundaries. So relativism, to be consistent, would have to say rescuing that boy would be wrong if the guys around you or the culture around you would say that it's wrong. No matter what you say in the situation, that culture gets to determine what is right or wrong. Similarly, if they were in your culture, if they visited the United States, they came to Waterloo, and they saw something they thought was horribly wrong, for them to intervene, for them to step in and claim some moral justification for interfering would also be wrong, because it's your culture and they have no right to interfere with that. Now we'll go back to that question a little bit, but let's move then to soft and hard universalism. If you are a soft universalist, what you would do in this situation is say, I recognize that I'm in a different culture. I'm not stupid, and I'm not arrogant enough to think that all cultures are the same. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that I just have all the right answers. I recognize that I come from a culture. So I'm in sympathy with the relativist, that I need to be aware of my own biases and that they don't come from heaven, they come from my background and my culture. On the other hand, the soft universalist would say, I don't see why, if I was raised in Waterloo and someone else was raised in Argentina and someone else was raised in India, I don't see why my culture and my values can't share some things with the cultures of India and the cultures of Argentina. At one level, we still are all human beings. So perhaps the soft universalist says there are common human values that all cultures recognize, even if they give them different names and they draw some different conclusions about them, if still there's something in common. So if I go to India, and with all of my misunderstandings and all of my cultural perspectives, they say it still might be possible for me to learn about Indian culture enough, to talk with people enough, to observe what they do, and they observe what I do, and I come to find out and to discover, perhaps, that they care about families and my culture cares about families. Families might look a little different, they might be organized a little differently, but still you're supposed to be loyal to your brother in both cultures. So the soft universalists would try to find points of contact, points of commonality and agreement, where you begin to build sort of piece by piece, very patiently, understandings between cultures. Now, of course, this is a huge, huge project because there are, thousands of cultures. There's no guarantee if two cultures happen to agree on something that the third will agree or the fourth will agree. So this would be a huge project to research what are the basic values of each culture, and are there some that are shared in every culture. But there's a fundamental difference between the relativist and the soft universalist. The relativist is a skeptic, a very hard skeptic, about the possibility of someone from one culture really entering into another culture enough to understand it, and to communicate with them about values that they might share. All of that effort, the relativist thinks, is futile, because what defines our ethics is that we are within a culture and we carry that in our heads no matter what. The soft universalist thinks maybe there's a little more to human communication and human interaction across cultures that would enable us to build some bridges that aren't obvious at first. Now, the hard universalist. The hard universalist is going to say to the relativist, you have simply drawn the wrong conclusion about ethics. You have looked around at the world's cultures and you've looked at so many disagreements between people that get very heated at times and very difficult, and people don't come to agreements, and you have said, you know what, let's learn a lesson from this. The relativist would say the lesson to be learned is all of us should stay in our own cultures and be humble enough to recognize that all of our values come from a specific place and time that may not be relevant to any other place and time. So stop trying to criticize or improve or correct other cultures. It makes no sense. It's harmful. Stop doing it. And the hard universalist will say that's all true, that we have oppressed people in the past, there's been cultural misunderstanding, that it's difficult to arrive at common agreements across cultures, but just because it's hard doesn't prove it's impossible. In fact, like the soft universalist, they will point to lots of ways in which cultures change, and sometimes they change precisely in response to contact with other cultures. So you could argue that European cultures have changed drastically in the last 500 years for many reasons, but one of those reasons may be that in their zeal to conquer the world, to colonize the world, they met a lot of different people, a lot of different cultures, and were exposed to a lot of different ideas. And at first they weren't interested in those ideas. They thought these people are just savages, we don't need to listen to them. But over time, they began to pay more attention and learn lots and lots of things from these people they had really dismissed and oppressed earlier. So that would be an example where cultural interaction, even cultural interaction that is aimed at violence and oppression, nonetheless can have the effect of transforming a culture, ultimately. So the hard universalist would say, let's not be so skeptical about the possibility of learning across cultures, even about ethics. But furthermore, the hard universalist is much more optimistic about the ability of human beings, let's say, to rise above their cultures. I'd say that's the key idea for the hard universalist, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the hard universalist is going to say that there's no reason to treat culture as the ultimate boundary of our understanding, that it's entirely possible for us to understand things that are not simply due to our cultural influence. So, for example, I was born into a culture that uses English, and I can't speak Chinese, many other languages. But I can have translated for me ideas and truths, say in science. So if there's some scientific research done in the Chinese language, it can be translated into the English language, and then I can share and I can understand with my mind the very same ideas that that Chinese scientist was thinking. My sharing is in English, my thinking is in English, but English is like the bridge. It's just like the way I'm able to think beyond English to an idea that doesn't depend upon English. And I know it doesn't depend on English because someone thought about it in Chinese. So it's possible, according to the hard universalist, that our minds are not just tied to culture, but have the power, we'd have to ask how, but have the power to grasp ideas and truths that, even though they're expressed culturally, say in a language, the ideas themselves don't depend on any culture or language. They're true, independent of that. So the hard universalist wants to look at the situation with the boys fighting and say, don't be so quick to back away out of embarrassment for offending another culture. Don't be so quick to deny yourself the possibility of doing the right thing in this situation. Yes, you may meet resistance from this other culture. What you need to do is ask yourself, are there some rules, are there some principles, are there some ideas, ethical teachings, which you believe, because you've thought about it very carefully, and you've tested these ideas, and they've convinced you that this idea, this rule, or this teaching is something that every human being with a brain, with a mind, that every human being would agree with and say that's a good way to live, if they actually stop to think about it. So the idea is something like this. If these guys who right now love gambling and love the boxing and doing all this stuff, if you were to sit them down and say, hey guys, can we talk about ethics a little bit? And can we talk about right and wrong? And the idea here is that even though they're raised in a certain culture that has some of these ideas, and even though I'm raised in a certain culture, slowly but surely we can communicate and begin to share some basic agreement about what makes things right and wrong that obviously doesn't depend on either one of our cultures, because our cultures tell us to do all kinds of things that may be wrong. But the hard universalist is searching for those universal, that's why we call them universalist, rules or principles that we are confident every human being would agree to if they would just take the time to step away from some of their cultural beliefs for a little while and think about right and wrong in a more general sense. So the hard universalist in this situation might say, every human being, if they have the chance to think about it and really consider it, not with respect to their own culture, but more generally, every human being would agree that exploiting children who really don't have the ability to say no, don't have the ability to resist. So it'd be broader than children, perhaps. Any exploitation of the powerless, could be children, could be physically handicapped people, or people who can't resist, or prisoners. Any violence done against helpless people, or any pressure put against helpless people that causes them pain and suffering against their will, is wrong. Not just here, not just now. It's always wrong to take helpless people, defenseless people, and to either harm them directly or tell them to harm themselves or to have them harm themselves for your entertainment. That's a violation that everyone, we think, would recognize, and therefore I'm going to step in, I'm going to grab that kid, and I'm going to tell these guys to get the hell out of here because what you're doing is wrong. Not because I'm an American, but because I'm a rational person who wants to do what's right, and I know what you're doing is not right. So they would step in, absolutely.